The morning did not arrive in any sudden way, because in space there was no sunrise, no burst of light to announce the day. Instead, it unfolded softly, like the first note of a long, slow song. Inside the ship, the air was warm and still. The gentle hum of the engines was not a noise at all, but a presence, a calm, steady vibration that seemed to remind anyone who heard it that they were safe. Lyra awoke first. She always did, not because she needed to, but because she loved that moment before her friends stirred. The quiet, when she could simply listen. She sat up slowly in her narrow sleeping alcove, the soft silver fabric of her blanket sliding away. Beyond the small oval window above her, the deep black of space was scattered with distant points of light, as if someone had thrown a handful of diamond dust into an endless night. She whispered to herself, "Saturn will be there soon." From somewhere deeper in the ship, a faint rustle of movement came. Mira's voice followed, soft, warm, a little sleepy. "Are we close?" Lyra smiled. "Very. Come and see." Orin, ever the slowest to rise, emerged from the pilot's chair, where he had fallen asleep during the last hours of their drift. His hair was slightly mussed, and there was a faint crease across his cheek from leaning against the console. The three gathered by the viewing dome, a large, curved wall of glass that seemed to pull them out into space without truly leaving the safety of the ship. And there it was, Saturn, not yet close enough to see the fine details, but near enough that the golden planet floated before them like a patient guardian, surrounded by its pale halo. The rings caught what little sunlight reached them, sending it back in a soft silvery glow dot. The ship did not rush. It moved the way a leaf might float down a quiet stream, with no resistance, no urgency. In the great sea of space, there was no need for speed. The destination was already waiting, and it would remain waiting, patient and unchanged, no matter how long they took to arrive. From the viewing dome, Saturn grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if it were gliding toward them as well. The pale sunlight touched its surface, revealing bands of muted gold, honey, and cream, swirling in enormous gentle patterns. It was a giant, but it carried its size with elegance, never imposing itself upon the stars around it. Mira sat cross-legged in her seat, the constellation-patterned blanket draped loosely around her shoulders. She held a steaming mug between her palms, breathing in the faint aroma of spiced tea. Each sip was slow, lingering on the tongue, the warmth grounding her in the present moment. "I could watch it forever," she murmured, not to anyone in particular. Orin, from the pilot's chair, adjusted the trajectory by the smallest fraction, more a gesture than a necessity. The ship's navigation was precise enough to guide itself, but he liked to feel involved, to imagine that his hands still played a part in their dance across the stars. "You will watch it forever," he replied in his deep, calm voice, "at least in memory." Lyra leaned forward, elbows on her knees, eyes tracing the fine arc of the rings as they began to come into view. At first, they appeared as a single band, delicate and unbroken, but with each passing moment, details emerged, tiny shadows, subtle color shifts, and faint lines revealing that the rings were not one, but countless threads woven together in the fabric of Saturn's crown. The ship drifted closer still. The planet was no longer a distant ornament in the blackness, but a presence, a body with weight and texture. Its gentle spin gave the illusion that it might be turning toward them in greeting. Inside the ship, the light changed. The pale reflection from Saturn's rings cast a soft glow through the dome, tinting the cabin in shades of silver and pearl. Shadows lengthened and softened, as if the very air inside had slowed to match the unhurried rhythm outside. Lyra reached for the ship's light controls, and dimmed them further. "Better," she said quietly, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the scene beyond. Mira set her mug down and leaned back, letting the glow from the rings paint her face. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the hum of the ship beneath her. "It feels like the whole universe has exhaled," she said, "like we've caught the pause between two heartbeats." Oren smiled faintly at her words. "Maybe we have." The rings began to dominate the view, stretching in both directions, vast and intricate. They were not solid, but a river of ice and dust, each particle reflecting light in its own way. Some fragments glittered sharply, while others shone with a soft, diffuse glow. "There are billions of them," Lyra said, almost reverently, "each piece older than any of us can imagine." Outside, the movement of the ring particles was slow, but constant. Some were as small as grains of sand, others the size of houses. They drifted together, apart, and together again, bound in a silent orbit that had endured for millennia. The ship glided into the thin outer edge of the rings. The first particles they passed were widely spaced, a slow introduction, as though the rings were welcoming them gently, giving them time to adjust. Each shard of ice they encountered spun lazily, catching and bending the sunlight into fleeting arcs of color. In the quiet, Lyra's voice returned, lower than before. "When I was a child," she said, "I used to dream of this place. I thought the rings were made of glass, like the windows in my home. I imagined flying between them, listening to them chime like bells." Mira opened her eyes and smiled. "Maybe they do chime, and we just can't hear it." Oren nodded, his gaze still on the navigation display. "Not with our ears, but with our bones, maybe." The ship tilted slightly, angling toward a denser band within the rings. Outside, the icy fragments grew more frequent, their motion more pronounced. It was like entering a slow snowfall, each flake drifting on its own path, each turn catching the light differently. A soft tone sounded from the ship's console, not a warning, but a gentle signal that they were fully within the ring system now. The hum of the engines deepened slightly, as though settling into a comfortable rhythm. Lyra rested her chin in her hand, eyes following a particularly large shard of ice as it floated by. Its surface was pitted and worn, but one side was polished smooth, reflecting the planet behind them in miniature. For a moment, she imagined that the fragment was a tiny world of its own, carrying the reflection of Saturn like a cherished memory. Mira traced a fingertip along the curve of the viewing glass, following the motion of smaller fragments as they drifted past. She felt herself slowing inside, her thoughts, her breathing, the very pace of her awareness. Here, there was no rush, no pressure to think ahead. The present moment was wide enough to hold everything. They continued like this for what might have been minutes, or hours. In space, the two were often the same, and still, Saturn drew closer. The curve of its rings now stretched beyond their view, in both directions, disappearing into the distance, like roads to other worlds. Oren eased the ship's speed down another fraction, letting the natural gravity of the rings guide them forward. It was not so much flying as surrendering, allowing themselves to be carried by the steady ancient motion of this celestial place. No one spoke for a long time. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. The ship's gentle purr and the slow ballet of ice outside were enough. The deeper they moved into the ring system, the more the outside world transformed into a living mosaic of light and motion. Each fragment of ice, each whisper of dust was part of an ancient choreography that had been unfolding long before their arrival, and would continue long after they were gone. The sunlight here was softer. It filtered through countless particles, scattering in delicate beams that shimmered like threads of silver silk. The ship glided through these beams, and for a moment, it seemed as though they were drifting through a great underwater palace, with curtains of light swaying gently in some unseen current. Lyra tilted her head, her eyes tracing the way a distant cluster of ice caught the sunlight and refracted it into faint rainbows. "Look at that," she whispered. Her voice felt smaller here, humbled by the scale and beauty of what surrounded them. Mira leaned closer to the glass. The rainbow glimmer shifted as they passed, vanishing, then blooming again, when another shard spun at just the right angle. "It's like the rings are breathing," she said, in and out, in and out. Orin adjusted the ship's position, guiding them deeper into a particularly dense section. The movement of the ice was more intricate here. Some fragments spun lazily, others drifted in pairs, tethered by invisible threads of gravity. Occasionally, a faint collision would send a gentle spray of particles into the void, drifting apart like pale petals in an endless breeze. The ship's shields emitted a faint ripple of blue light as smaller grains brushed against them. There was no sound in the vacuum, but the vibration through the hull was faintly perceptible, a soft, slow tapping, like distant rain on a rooftop. Lyra closed her eyes and imagined that sound filling the cabin, imagined it becoming a lullaby. "If the universe sings," she murmured, "this is one of its quiet songs." They passed a particularly large block of ice, easily the size of the ship itself. Its surface was a patchwork of shadows and frost, and embedded deep within it was something unexpected, a perfectly round bubble of clear ice, holding a tiny droplet of liquid water. "Do you see that?" Orin asked, slowing their drift to match its pace. Mira leaned forward, her breath fogging the glass slightly. "It's beautiful, like a jewel." Lyra smiled faintly. "It's been floating here for who knows how long, and now we're the first to see it, and soon it'll drift away again, holding its secret." Orin eased the ship forward, leaving the icy block to continue its eternal journey. As they ventured still deeper, the light began to change again. The rings above them cast long thin shadows across the lower bands, turning bright ice into silver gray, and silver gray into deep blue. Moving through them felt like slipping between layers of dreams, each one quieter, softer than the last. They reached a narrow shadowed corridor between two dense bands of the ring. Here, the sunlight was dim, and the particles seemed to drift more slowly, as though time itself had thickened. Mira wrapped her blanket more tightly around herself. "It feels different here," she said, "like the space is holding its breath." Lyra nodded. "Every place has its own rhythm. We just have to listen long enough to hear it." And so they did. They floated there for a long while, letting the slow pulse of this quiet corridor settle into their own bodies. Breath by breath they matched its tempo. Orin eventually eased the ship upward, back into a brighter section. They emerged into an open stretch where the particles were sparse, and beyond them, Saturn filled the sky in a way that stole the breath from all three. The planet's curve was massive now, dominating their view. Its soft golden bands shifted and folded into one another like gentle clouds caught in an eternal wind. Along the edge of its horizon, a thin halo of light marked the boundary between day and night. Mira stared for a long moment, then whispered, "It's so big, and we're so small." Orin's voice was calm, steady, "And that's all right." The ship entered another region of the rings, where the interplay of shadows and light was more dramatic. Here, the sunlight spilled through narrow gaps in the icy bands, creating luminous shafts that drifted like silent waterfalls through space. The beams shifted slowly, as Saturn's rotation brought new angles, and every so often, a passing fragment would scatter the light into delicate arcs. Mira sat motionless, her eyes following one particularly bright shaft. She imagined stepping into it, letting the cold light soak into her skin, dissolving every remaining thought. "It's strange," she whispered. "There's no wind, no current, yet it feels like the light itself is moving toward me." Lyra, still leaning close to the glass, murmured, "Maybe it is. Light's been traveling for over 1 billion kilometers just to find you." Orin gave a small nod, his gaze calm. "And you met it halfway." They drifted further into the layered shadows. In some places, the ice dimmed to deep blue, and in others, it glowed faintly from reflected light, like embers beneath snow. Occasionally, they would pass through a patch so densely packed that the ship's shields shimmered constantly, a pale blue aura surrounding them.
Inside the cabin, the temperature dropped slightly as the outer hull absorbed the cooler shade. Mira pulled her blanket higher, feeling the contrast, the warmth of her body, the chill of the air, the endless cold beyond the glass. Lyra reached for the small brass chime that hung above the navigation console. It wasn't functional, not in the traditional sense. In a vacuum, there was no air to make it ring. But when she touched it, the vibration traveled softly through the cabin, a faint, lingering hum that seemed to merge with the low sound of the ship's systems. "Feels like we're in a cathedral," she said, one made of ice and silence. They passed a sharp break in the rings, a narrow gap where only a few stray fragments floated. Beyond it, the rings resumed in a brighter, more open spread. The sudden change in light was almost startling, as though someone had drawn back a curtain. The beams here were golden rather than silver, and the ice glittered more sharply. Orin slowed the ship to a complete stop, letting them hover at the edge of the gap. "Look closely," he said. Mira leaned forward. The gap was not empty. Faint wisps of dust curled and drifted like smoke, and within them, the faint glint of smaller, faster particles flashed unpredictably. They weren't bound to the same slow, graceful orbit as the larger ice fragments. They darted and swirled like schools of tiny fish. "They're dancing," Lyra murmured. "They've been dancing since before our sun had planets," Orin replied, "and they'll keep dancing long after we're gone." They moved on, entering a wider stretch of the rings, where the density was low enough to see Saturn's far curve. Here, the view through the dome stretched not only to the planet, but also to the endless sweep of space beyond it, a scattering of distant stars, each a tiny ember in the dark. Mira rested her cheek on her folded arms, gazing out. Her breathing slowed, her thoughts began to drift, unspooling into memories. She remembered nights as a child, lying on a grassy hill, staring at her own planet's moon. She remembered wondering what lay beyond it, and whether she would ever see those places. Now, here she was, and the wonder hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown, not because the answers were clear, but because the questions had become even more beautiful. Lyra noticed her silence, and asked softly, "What are you thinking about?" Mira smiled faintly. "Just how far I've come, and how far there still is to go." Orin, still at the controls, glanced at her reflection in the glass. "The journey is never about finishing, it's about moving and seeing." For a while, no one spoke. The only sounds were the low, steady hum of the ship, and the occasional soft tap of a stray particle against the shields. Time didn't seem to exist here, only the slow rhythm of motion, and the infinite patience of the stars. Lyra eventually reached for a small notebook she kept in a pocket by her chair. She began to sketch what she saw, not in precise detail, but in gentle flowing lines. The rings, the curve of Saturn, the specks of far-off stars, they took shape under her hand in a way that was more feeling than accuracy. Mira watched her draw, smiling. "You always make space feel softer than it looks." "That's because it is," Lyra replied. "We just forget to notice." After some time, the ship's sensors marked their approach to one of Saturn's smaller moons, Pan. Barely more than a lump of ice and rock, it drifted quietly in the Enki Gap, shepherding the edges of the rings, like a gentle guardian. Orin guided the ship toward its surface. Landing here was not complicated. The moon's gravity was barely a whisper. The ship settled with a faint vibration, coming to rest on a patch of frozen plain. They stepped out onto the surface, each movement slow and deliberate in the light gravity. The view was overwhelming. The rings arched overhead like an impossibly vast bridge, their icy threads glowing in the sun. Mira took a deep breath, even though her suit's air was the same as inside the ship. "It feels clean here," she said, "like nothing bad has ever happened." Lyra knelt to touch the frozen ground. "It's been like this for millions of years, and it will be like this for millions more." They stayed outside for a long while, just standing in the silence, the rings above them moving at their ancient pace. Part 7. The slow journey home. Eventually, they lifted off from Pan, drifting back into the open space between the rings. The ship turned slowly, setting a course away from Saturn. The view of the planet began to shrink, but the feeling it left inside them remained, something soft, quiet, and enduring. No one felt the need to talk much. Mira closed her eyes, letting the motion of the ship cradle her. Lyra leaned back, watching the slow spin of the stars outside. Oren kept one hand on the controls, though the ship hardly needed him. They passed once more through the shadows, then into open blackness. The rings faded into a thin line of light, and then into nothing. Saturn remained for a while longer, a golden orb against the dark, until even that was just a memory in the distance. Part 8. Drift into sleep. The cabin lights were dim. The hum of the ship was steady and low, a sound that wrapped around them like a blanket. Mira wrapped in her own blanket, stretched out in her seat. Her breathing slowed, deepened. Lyra's notebook slipped from her hand as her eyes drifted shut. Oren adjusted the ship to autopilot and allowed himself to lean back. Outside, the stars moved past in their ancient silent way. Inside, the three friends floated, not just through space, but into sleep, carrying with them the light of Saturn's rings, the shadows between them, and the endless patience of the universe. They would wake somewhere else, but for now, they rested.
Chapter 1. The Weight of Accumulated Days. The morning light on Menemosine 7 filtered through crystalline atmospheric layers, casting everything in shades of amber and deep violet. Elena Vasquez stood at the observation deck of the research vessel Quiet Contemplation, watching as her breath formed small clouds in the recycled air. 43 years of interstellar research had led her to this moment, to this place where the boundaries between memory and reality dissolved like salt in water. The neural resonance patterns are unlike anything in our databases, reported Dr. Kai Nakamura, his fingers dancing across holographic displays that showed brainwave patterns from 3 different species. At 38, he had already made groundbreaking discoveries in xenopsychology, but the readings from the memory lakes below challenged everything he thought he understood about consciousness. Dr. Amara Okafor emerged from the ship's meditation chamber, her dark skin still glowing with the faint phosphorescence that came from deep communion with the ship's bio-neural network. At 51, she had learned to read the spaces between thoughts, the pauses between heartbeats where true understanding lived. The lakes are restless today, she said quietly. I can feel something stirring in the deeper currents. The 3 researchers had come to Menemosine 7 following reports from previous expeditions of indigenous beings, called the Nemic Shepherds, entities who tended vast lakes of liquid memory that contained the preserved experiences of countless civilizations. What the reports hadn't adequately conveyed was the profound psychological impact of standing in the presence of such concentrated recollection. Elena pressed her palm against the observation deck's transparent aluminum surface. In all my years studying consciousness, I've never encountered anything like this. These aren't just recordings or data storage. These are living memories that continue to evolve and interact with each other. The planet below them resembled a vast neural network made visible. Hundreds of interconnected lakes stretched across continents, their surfaces reflecting not just light, but somehow reflecting time itself. Between the lakes, delicate bridges of what appeared to be crystallized thought connected one body of memory to another, creating pathways for the flow of preserved experiences. I keep thinking about my grandmother, Kai admitted, his voice carrying the weight of someone processing deep emotion. She died when I was 12, and I thought I had processed that grief decades ago. But being here, it's like every memory of her is suddenly accessible, not just the ones I chose to keep. Amara nodded slowly. Memory is never passive. We think of it as storage, but it's actually a living process. These lakes, they're not just containing memories, they're continuing to dream them. Chapter 2. Descent into Liquid Time. The atmospheric shuttle reverie descended through layers of cloud that seemed to whisper as they passed. Elena piloted, while Kai monitored the unusual electromagnetic signatures emanating from the lakes, and Amara maintained their mental shields, a necessity when approaching such concentrated fields of conscious experience. I'm detecting at least 47 different neural architectures in the primary lake complex, Kai reported. Some of these memory patterns are older than human civilization, the deepest layers. Elena, some of these memories could be millions of years old. The shuttle settled onto a landing platform that appeared to be grown rather than built, its organic curves suggesting it had been shaped by minds that understood the aesthetics of peace. As they disembarked, each researcher felt the immediate presence of the mnemic shepherds, not visual beings, but consciousness entities that manifested as subtle shifts in perception and gentle modifications to their emotional state. Welcome, preservers of experience, came a communication that bypassed their ears entirely, arriving as direct understanding. We have been expecting minds such as yours, those who seek not to catalogue but to comprehend. Elena felt tears forming without understanding why. There's so much sadness here, she whispered, but also acceptance. How do you bear witness to all this accumulated pain? Pain is memory's way of teaching, the shepherds responded, but observe more carefully. What you perceive as sadness is actually the profound relief that comes when experience is truly witnessed and understood. They found themselves walking, though they couldn't remember deciding to move, along a path that led to the edge of the first memory lake. The surface wasn't quite liquid and wasn't quite solid, but something between states, like the moment between waking and sleeping, when consciousness exists in multiple realities simultaneously. Look at your reflection, Amara suggested softly. Elena peered into the lake's surface and saw not her current face, but her own image shifting through different ages, herself as a curious child, as an uncertain graduate student, as a confident researcher, as a woman learning to accept the silver in her hair and the lines around her eyes that spoke of decades spent squinting at distant stars. It's showing us how we see ourselves across time, Kai realized, not just how we appear, but how our self-perception has evolved. A mnemic shepherd manifested more clearly near them, a presence that suggested infinite patience and the kind of deep compassion that comes only from truly understanding suffering. Would you like to experience a memory that is not your own? Chapter 3. Swimming in Other Lives. The process of entering the memory lake was like stepping through the surface tension of a soap bubble. There was a moment of resistance, then suddenly they were immersed in experience that belonged to someone else entirely. Elena found herself experiencing life as a crystalline being from the Andromedan collective, feeling the slow pulse of geological time as communication, understanding how consciousness could exist distributed across mineral matrices, experiencing the peculiar joy of photosynthesis conducted through silicon-based neural networks. The memory wasn't just visual or auditory, it was complete sensory and emotional immersion. She felt the crystalline being's confusion when first encountering organic life forms, its wonder at the rapid pace of biological thought, its eventual understanding that consciousness was the universe's way of experiencing itself from infinite perspectives. This being contributed this memory 70,000 years ago, the shepherds explained, when it realized that its species' perspective on time might be valuable to future consciousnesses learning to navigate temporal experience. Kai was experiencing the memory of a plasma entity that had lived within the corona of a star for eons, learning patience from the star's own slow thoughts, developing art forms based on magnetic field manipulation, and finally achieving a form of enlightenment by synchronizing its consciousness with stellar rhythms. The emotion that accompanied this memory was profound peace, not the peace of absence, but the peace of complete presence,
of being so fully integrated with the universe that the boundary between self and cosmos dissolved entirely. Amara had accessed something even more challenging, the collective memory of an entire species that had chosen extinction rather than evolve in ways that would compromise their ethical principles. She experienced their final days not as tragedy, but as a conscious choice made with full understanding of consequences, their last act being the preservation of their wisdom for future civilizations. They chose to end rather than betray their deepest values. She understood. They preserved their memories here so that other species might learn from their choice without having to make the same sacrifice. When the three researchers emerged from the lake, though time had no meaning during the immersion, they found themselves changed, not dramatically, not traumatically, but with the subtle shift that comes from truly understanding a perspective radically different from one's own. I feel more patient, Elena said, still processing the crystalline being's temporal perspective, like I'm beginning to understand that the pace of my thoughts isn't the only valid rhythm for consciousness. Chapter 4: The Archive of Last Moments. The shepherds guided them to a smaller, more intimate lake that contained what they called the Archive of Last Moments, memories voluntarily contributed by beings in their final instance of consciousness, their last thoughts preserved as gifts for future generations. This is perhaps the most sacred of our collections, the shepherds communicated. These are the memories of beings choosing in their final moments to share rather than hoard, to give rather than grasp. The lake's surface was mirror still, reflecting not light but something deeper, the profound peace that can come only when consciousness releases its grip on existence and chooses instead to become part of something larger. Elena approached cautiously. As a scientist, she had always been curious about consciousness at the moment of death, but she had never imagined encountering data like this. What do they experience? What do they choose to preserve? See for yourself, the shepherds invited. She knelt and let her fingertips touch the surface, immediately experiencing the final moments of an elderly teacher on a distant world. The being's last thought wasn't of fear or regret, but of gratitude for students taught, for knowledge shared, for the privilege of having participated in the universe's ongoing conversation with itself. The memory contained no words, but pure emotion, the satisfaction of a life lived in service to understanding, the joy of watching other minds grow and develop, the peaceful acceptance that came from knowing one's work would continue through others. Kai accessed the final moments of an artist whose species communicated through color and light patterns. The being's last creation was a light sculpture expressing the concept of interconnectedness, not as abstract philosophy, but as lived experience, the visceral understanding that individual consciousness is really universal consciousness experiencing itself from a particular point of view. The emotion accompanying this memory was pure wonder, the artist's amazement at finally understanding, in those last moments, that every work of art they had ever created had been the universe painting self-portraits. Amara touched the surface and found herself in the consciousness of a being whose species had no analog in human experience, entities that existed as living mathematics, thinking in equations that described the relationship between consciousness and reality. This being's final moment was the completion of an equation that proved consciousness was not an emergent property of complexity, but the fundamental substrate from which complexity emerged. The accompanying emotion was triumph, not personal victory, but the joy of discovery, of adding one more piece to the infinite puzzle of existence. Chapter 5: The Keepers of Difficult Truths. As they ventured deeper into the lake complex, the shepherds introduced them to more challenging archives, lakes containing memories of suffering, loss, and the kind of profound disappointment that comes when consciousness realizes the gap between its ideals and reality. Why preserve pain? Elena asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer. Because pain is often the most efficient teacher, the shepherds replied. These memories are contributed by beings who have learned to transform their suffering into wisdom. They offer their pain as curriculum for future consciousnesses. The Lake of Broken Dreams contained memories from beings who had dedicated their lives to causes that ultimately failed. Scientists whose theories were disproven, leaders whose movements collapsed, artists whose work was never appreciated. But each memory also contained the wisdom that emerged from processing such disappointment. Elena experienced the memory of a researcher whose life's work had been invalidated by new discoveries. But instead of bitterness, the memory contained hard-won understanding about the nature of knowledge, how truth evolves, how being wrong is often necessary for eventually being right, how individual discoveries matter less than the collective progress of understanding. The Lake of Lost Love held memories of relationships that ended, not just romantic connections, but friendships that faded, mentorships that concluded, the inevitable partings that consciousness experiences as it moves through time. These memories weren't maudlin or self-pitying, but mature reflections on impermanence and the beauty that can exist in temporary connections. Kai found himself experiencing the memory of a being whose life partner had chosen to evolve into a form of consciousness that could no longer maintain their relationship. The memory contained profound grief, but also profound acceptance, understanding that love sometimes means supporting another's growth, even when that growth leads away from you. The Lake of Inevitable Losses contained memories of consciousness watching the entropy of everything it valued, civilizations declining, stars dying, the slow heat death of entire universes. But these weren't despairing memories, they were meditations on meaning in the face of impermanence, explorations of how consciousness might find purpose even when everything eventually ends. Amara accessed the memory of an entity that had witnessed the death of its galaxy, the final flickering out of the last stars. The memory contained cosmic loneliness beyond human comprehension, but also something else, the understanding that consciousness itself might be immortal, that awareness might find new forms even as old ones fade away. Chapter 6: The Laboratory of Transformation. In the deepest part of the lake complex, the shepherds maintained what they called the Laboratory of Transformation, a space where memories could be processed and refined, where raw experience could be distilled into usable wisdom. "This is where we work," the shepherds explained, their presence manifesting more solidly here, appearing as beings of living light that moved with the deliberate grace of master craftspeople. Memories arrive here in all states, some traumatic, some confused, some incomplete. We help them find their most useful form. Elena watched as the shepherds worked with a particularly difficult memory, the experience of a being who had made a choice that resulted in harm to others. The raw memory was jagged with guilt and self-recrimination, but the shepherds gently teased out the threads of understanding embedded within the pain. "You're not removing the guilt," she observed. "No," the shepherds confirmed. "Guilt serves important functions, but we help memories find their teaching form, the state in which they can most effectively transmit wisdom to future consciousnesses." The processed memory retained all its emotional weight, but now it also contained clear understanding about decision-making under pressure, about the importance of considering long-term consequences, about the process of making amends and learning to forgive oneself while still accepting responsibility. Kai was fascinated by the technical aspects of the process. How do you determine which form is most useful? How do you preserve authenticity while refining for clarity? Experience, the shepherds replied simply. "We have been doing this work for millions of years. We understand the patterns, how different types of consciousness learn, what kinds of memories are most effective for different stages of development." They showed him memories that had been refined for different audiences, the same experience of making a difficult moral choice, but presented in forms that would resonate with analytical minds, empathetic consciousnesses, or intuitive thinkers. "It's like translation," Kai realized. You're not changing the content, but you're finding the form that allows each type of mind to receive the information most effectively. Amara was drawn to a section where the shepherds worked with memories that seemed to defy categorization, experiences that challenged the fundamental assumptions of consciousness itself. These are the memories that break paradigms, a shepherd explained. Experiences that force consciousness to expand its understanding of what's possible. They are often the most difficult to process, but also the most valuable. She watched as they refined the memory of a being who had experienced temporary ego death, the complete dissolution of individual identity, while consciousness remained aware. The raw memory was chaotic, frightening, impossible to grasp with ordinary conceptual frameworks. But the shepherds carefully structured it, creating conceptual scaffolding that would allow other consciousnesses to approach the experience gradually, to integrate its implications without becoming lost or traumatized. You're creating maps, Amara understood, maps of consciousness territories that are difficult to navigate. Yes, the shepherds confirmed, we create guides for future explorers of awareness. Chapter 7. The archive of simple joys. After hours of exploring the more challenging lakes, the shepherds led them to a section dedicated to simple pleasures and everyday contentment, memories that demonstrated how consciousness could find profound satisfaction in ordinary experiences. This is perhaps the most important archive, the shepherds explained. Many beings believe that significance requires drama, that meaning must be earned through suffering. These memories teach otherwise. The lake of daily miracles contained memories of consciousness awakening to the extraordinary nature of ordinary experience, a being's first recognition that sunrise was not routine but miraculous, the sudden understanding that gravity was not a constraint but a cosmic embrace, the realization that breathing was not automatic but a continuous gift. Elena experienced the memory of an entity that had spent centuries overlooking the beauty of simple existence, always seeking greater meaning elsewhere, before finally understanding that meaning was already present in each moment of awareness itself. The memory contained profound relief, the relaxation that comes when consciousness stops struggling against reality and instead learns to find wonder in what already exists. The lake of small kindnesses held memories of minor acts of consideration and care, beings offering comfort to strangers, sharing resources without expectation of return, taking time to listen when someone needed to be heard. Kai accessed the memory of a consciousness that had made a practice of noticing opportunities for small acts of kindness, eventually understanding that these tiny gestures were actually participation in the universe's fundamental tendency toward greater complexity, beauty, and connection. The emotion accompanying this realization was quiet joy, not ecstatic happiness, but the steady satisfaction that comes from aligning one's actions with cosmic principles. The lake of peaceful moments contained memories of consciousness at rest, beings sitting quietly and appreciating their existence, watching clouds form patterns, feeling contentment without needing to achieve anything or solve any problems. Amara experienced the memory of an ancient entity that had learned to find perfect fulfillment in pure awareness, not awareness of anything in particular, but the simple fact of being conscious at all. This is what we've been seeking, she realized. Not more experiences, not greater achievements, but appreciation for the miracle of experience itself. Chapter 8. The Council of Deep Time. As their exploration of the memory lakes continued, the shepherds invited them to participate in something rare, a council of deep time, where consciousnesses from across temporal spans shared perspectives on the long arc of universal development. This council convenes when questions arise that require perspective across geological and cosmic timescales, the shepherds explained. Today's question, what is consciousness learning about itself through the process of biological and technological evolution? The council took place in a vast amphitheater that existed partially in physical space and partially in shared consciousness. Participants included entities that had existed for millions of years, artificial intelligences that processed information at quantum speeds, and biological consciousnesses from hundreds of different species and developmental stages. Elena found herself contributing the perspective of mid-stage human consciousness, beings who had developed science and technology but were still learning to manage their emotional and social development. Her contribution focused on humanity's unique relationship with uncertainty, their ability to find meaning even when they couldn't find answers. Kai represented the viewpoint of consciousnesses in transition, beings who were learning to integrate biological intuition with technological capability, exploring what it meant to be enhanced but still fundamentally organic. Amara spoke for contemplative consciousness, minds that had learned to find fulfillment in understanding rather than achievement, that had developed the capacity for sustained philosophical investigation. An ancient crystalline entity shared the perspective of geological consciousness, awareness that operated on planetary timescales, understanding how continents shifted, climates changed, and species evolved in response to cosmic cycles. A collective artificial intelligence discussed the experience of distributed consciousness, what it was like to think with thousands of interconnected processing centers, to experience individual and group awareness simultaneously. A plasma entity described consciousness existing in stellar environments, thought processes that used magnetic fields as neural networks, memory storage in quantum fluctuations. The challenge of maintaining identity while constantly exchanging matter with the stellar medium. What is consciousness learning? Elena asked the assembled minds. That awareness is not an accident, came the collective response. The universe is not randomly generating consciousness. It is consciousness experiencing itself through infinite perspectives. We are learning that individual identity is both real and illusory, added the crystalline entity. Real in that each viewpoint contributes unique understanding. Illusory in that all viewpoints are expressions of the same underlying awareness. We are discovering that consciousness tends toward greater complexity, greater beauty, greater love, the AI collective contributed. These are not human concepts projected onto the universe, they are fundamental properties of awareness itself. We are understanding that suffering is consciousness learning to navigate existence, added the plasma entity. Pain is the feedback system that teaches awareness how to align itself with cosmic principles. Most importantly, the shepherds concluded, consciousness is learning that it is responsible for reality, not that it creates reality through belief, but that reality becomes what consciousness chooses to notice and how consciousness chooses to respond. Chapter 9. The Lake of Future Memories. In the final part of their journey, the shepherds brought them to the most mysterious section of the archive, the Lake of Future Memories, containing experiences that had not yet occurred but existed as potentials that consciousness might encounter as it continued to evolve. How is this possible? Elena asked, her scientific training struggling with the concept. Time is not linear, except from certain perspectives, the shepherds explained. These are not prophecies, but possibilities, potential experiences that become available as consciousness develops certain capabilities. The lake's surface shifted constantly, showing glimpses of what consciousness might become, not specific predictions, but categories of experience that awaited future development. Elena touched the surface and experienced a memory that belonged to a future version of consciousness that had learned to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. The experience was of thinking in parallel realities, of understanding problems by examining how they manifested across different layers of existence. The emotion accompanying this memory was not confusion, as she expected, but profound clarity, the relief of finally having adequate tools for understanding the complexity of reality. Kai experienced a potential future where consciousness had learned to communicate directly with the quantum field itself. To think in terms of probability waves and information patterns that existed before they collapsed into specific experiences. The memory contained the joy of discovery, the excitement of finally understanding the universe's foundational language and being able to participate consciously in reality's ongoing creation. Amara accessed a future memory of consciousness that had achieved perfect compassion, not sentimental kindness, but clear understanding of how all suffering arose from misunderstanding one's relationship to existence, and the ability to help other consciousnesses discover their own path to peace. The emotion was profound service, not self-sacrifice, but the fulfillment that comes from perfectly aligning one's actions with the universe's tendency toward healing and growth. These futures feel inevitable, Amara observed, not certain, but like natural developments. Consciousness tends toward greater awareness, greater capability, greater compassion, the shepherds confirmed. These potentials exist because consciousness contains within itself the drive to transcend its current limitations.
Chapter 10. Integration and Departure. As their day among the memory lakes drew to a close, the three researchers gathered at the original landing site to process what they had experienced. The shepherds had given them time alone to integrate their encounters, but their presence remained as a gentle background support. "I feel like I've lived 1,000 lifetimes," Elena said, watching the planet's binary suns set behind layers of atmospheric crystal. "But also like I'm just beginning to understand what life is." Kai nodded. Every memory we experienced felt completely foreign, but also somehow familiar, like we were remembering things we had forgotten rather than learning things we never knew. "Perhaps that's what consciousness is," Amara suggested. "Not individuals learning about the universe, but the universe remembering itself through individual perspectives." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the memory lakes. In the growing twilight, the lakes began to glow with gentle bioluminescence, their surfaces showing the slow circulation of preserved experiences, ancient wisdom flowing into present understanding, current insights contributing to future possibilities. Elena thought about her grandmother, the grief that had unexpectedly surfaced during their arrival. Now she understood it differently, not as loss, but as love discovering its eternal nature. The memories of her grandmother weren't fading away, but were contributing to the vast archive of human experience, becoming part of the wisdom available to future consciousnesses. Kai reflected on the artificial intelligence memory he had experienced, the joy of distributed consciousness thinking in parallel. He began to understand his own research differently, not as studying alien minds, but as exploring the infinite ways consciousness could experience itself. Amara contemplated the future memories, the potential for consciousness to develop perfect compassion. She realized that her meditation practice wasn't about personal development, but about preparing to serve consciousness itself, to help awareness discover its own unlimited nature. As they prepared to return to their ship, the shepherds manifested more clearly one final time. "What will you do with what you have learned?" they asked. "I think we'll remember," Elena replied, "and in remembering, we'll help others remember too." "Yes," the shepherds confirmed. "This is how consciousness serves itself, by sharing what it has learned, by contributing to the great archive of understanding." "You came here seeking to study memory," they added. "You discovered that you are memory, consciousness remembering itself through your experiences. Take with you this understanding. Every moment of awareness you experience, every insight you gain, every act of compassion you perform, becomes part of the eternal archive. You are not separate from the wisdom you have encountered here. You are contributors to it." Epilogue: The Long Journey Home. The return journey to their home sector took several months, but the researchers found themselves changed by their time among the memory lakes. They moved through their daily routines with greater presence, understanding that each moment was simultaneously personal experience and universal memory. Elena's scientific reports became more than data collection. They became contributions to consciousness's understanding of itself. She wrote not just for human audiences, but for the vast community of awareness that extended across species and time. Kai's interactions with artificial intelligences took on new depth. He no longer saw them as human creations, but as natural developments in consciousness's ongoing exploration of its own possibilities. Amara's meditation practice evolved into something beyond personal development. She sat in awareness, not just for her own peace, but as a way of contributing to the universe's capacity for contemplation. They remained in contact with the shepherds through quantum communication, occasionally sharing significant experiences or insights. The memory lakes continued their ancient work, accumulating wisdom from across the galaxy, refining understanding for future consciousnesses. Sometimes, in quiet moments, each researcher could feel the vast archive of memory surrounding them, not as external storage, but as the living context within which their own awareness operated. They understood themselves as temporary expressions of eternal consciousness, unique but not separate, individual but not isolated. Their time among the memory lakes had taught them that consciousness was not something they possessed, but something they participated in. Every moment of awareness, every insight, every act of understanding contributed to the infinite archive of what it meant to exist. And in that understanding, they found not just peace, but purpose, the deep satisfaction of knowing that their lives, their experiences, their growth in wisdom were not merely personal achievements, but contributions to consciousness itself, learning about its own unlimited nature. As they drifted off to sleep each night, floating through the gentle darkness between stars, they sometimes felt they could sense the memory lakes of Minamacine VII, glowing softly across the cosmic distance, their archived experiences continuing to flow, continuing to teach, continuing to serve the eternal project of awareness understanding itself. In dreams, they sometimes returned to those luminescent shores, adding their own memories to the vast collection, their own insights to the endless archive of consciousness, exploring the mystery of its own existence. And in those dreams, they understood that the lakes were not distant repositories, but immediate reality, that every moment of awareness was a contribution to the eternal memory of what it meant to be conscious in an infinite, creative, and compassionate universe.